And hello to anyone who is watching this recording after the fact. We're so glad to know that you are following along. All right, so for this morning's collect, I've chosen one from the New Zealand Prayer Book. And let us pray. God, our ruler and guide, when we come to the place where the road divides, keep us true to the way of Christ, alive to present opportunities and confident of eternal life. Hear this prayer for your love's sake. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Patty, can you
Yes,
hear
ma'am.
me?
I can.
I think, could you let me into the meeting? I think I got out somehow.
Oh, but you're here. You can't see it?
No.
Can everyone else see?
I can
Yes.
see
Oh.
her.
We
Yeah.
can see you.
Let me do this. I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to start again and maybe that will help. That's so weird.
Yeah, I see Donna.
Yeah, we can
Yeah,
see
Donna,
you just
We
fine.
can see and
Did
hear
you
you.
see me?
Oh, now I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you so
Is that
much.
better?
Oh, good.
Yes, I'm fine.
Great.
Thank you.
And we
Marietta,
see,
It's blinking.
we see Marietta.
Yep, we can see you. We can hear you. This is wonderful.
Oh, wonderful. I can't see you.
Well, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Okay. All right. And so today we continue chugging through the Sermon on the Mount. And by my estimate, we are beginning chapter 7. Is that right?
Yes.
I think we finished our conversation about chapter 6 last time, but as always, if there are things that anyone wants to revisit from last time, we certainly can do that. We're in nobody's schedule but our own. Let me see if I can just get rid of this little bar down here. All right. Well, let me see. Okay, that's probably better. Was there anything left over from chapter 6 that we want to revisit, or are we good? Hearing nothing, that's great. Okay, so we're continuing. The context is the same as it has been. This is Jesus's teaching in Matthew's version of the sermon, where Matthew puts on the mount, Luke puts on the plain. We've talked before about why Matthew chooses the mountain.
Could be two different occasions.
Could be.
Jesus probably preached the same sermon more than once.
It's entirely possible. However, it's also possible that it's the same occasion and the gospelers simply adjusted the setting for the purposes of their narrative and their theological agenda. So since Matthew was so intent on fulfilling Hebrew scripture and making the connection with Moses, it just makes sense that he puts it on the mountain. So, but this is more of Jesus's teaching. And as we've said before, and to your point, Fred, a lot of this material could well have been repeated. And so it's not necessarily the case that Jesus just stood up or sat down in the habit of the rabbis and just spun out all of these sayings all at once. Perhaps he did. And it also is possible that it's a collection of Jesus material that had been circulating, and Matthew redacted it, put it together as one coherent sermon. So there's not a narrative so much right here as a series of teachings, lessons. So given that, we can kind of chunk it however we want. I'm going to suggest that maybe we try to do the first 11 verses as one chunk, and then go on. So would anyone like to read this beginning part for us?
Sure.
Thank you, Fred.
Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?
Hmm.
How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks the door will be open. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?
Thank
So
you. Oh, let's
oh.
pause there.
Okay.
Thank you. Just there's so much in those first 11 verses. Let's pause there for a second, then we'll go on.
The chunk that Fred is reading is the same Bible I have, and it has that one verse 12 is part of it.
Is chunked in with the rest.
Oh, okay. So go ahead. I'm sorry. I apologize.
So in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So where do y'all want to begin?
Well, once again, he has this quid pro quo.
I've got a more detailed question. What is this business about a log in people's eyes?
Yeah.
I mean, I have this weird cartoon image of a large 2x4 sticking out of someone's eye, and I thought, that can't be what they mean. But what?
It seems
I
to
think
be.
it's evident. I think it's evidence that Jesus had a sense of humor. He's making his audience laugh,
Mhm,
and they will remember it, and they will tell the story.
mhm.
They did.
I got to say, that's
Yes.
one of my favorite teachings of Jesus, because perhaps it's because it's one of which I am guilty so often, focusing on somebody else's fault when my fault is so much bigger and it's blinding me. But I'm taking much more interest in somebody else's idiosyncrasies or sins or irritations.
Yeah, I mean, there's a related thing where sometimes you accuse other people of precisely the faults that you got yourself, as a way of deflecting from
Exactly.
your own. And I mean, it gets to be, it can sometimes have a murderous effect when the Burmese government says the Rohingya are coming to attack us. They're trying to whip up fear and resentment so that they can go and attack the Rohingya.
Yeah.
Right? That
Great
kind of stuff.
example. Tragic example, but really,
Or the Russians saying they're going to denazify Ukraine.
right.
Yes.
So there is a human tendency to projection or
Yeah.
deflection. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes intentionally and sometimes not.
Exactly.
That was my exact thought, Ellie. I think some of these politicians or whatever, like they may be in the know and rationally and evilly doing that, whereas other people might not, people
Might not.
point fingers all the time, not looking at themselves, and they just need a little introspection,
Yeah, they just don't see the parallel.
They just don't see it, right?
Mhm.
So
Metacognition, lovely word I learned a little while ago.
Mhm.
An anecdote, a memorable anecdote. So the parish secretary smoked like a chimney, and one of the parishioners took her to task about it and told her she must stop smoking. Zub, 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 zub. And the woman just looked at her and said, "I'll do that when you stop drinking."
Ah,
Mhm.
Ah,
later died of alcoholism.
Oh,
Oh,
oh. So that's a true story.
Yeah. But it's a very true story, and it seems to me that it fits.
It
mhm.
fits.
It'll preach. I mean,
Absolutely will preach. Absolutely will preach. So what's Jesus's point in that teaching?
look inside yourself.
Hmm.
Be aware of your shortcomings.
Do your
Jesus
work,
is-
right? Yeah. Oh,
I
I'm
Jesus
think
is
that-
always asking you to help other people.
Yeah.
And in this one, he is sort of putting limits on how you know, what you think may be helping.
Mhm,
You're really, just like when you give alms, don't give them for your own benefit.
mhm, mhm.
The people who are doing this, who are engaging in this sort of thing, like the Pharisees or the people on street corners, they're pretending they're helping other people, but they're really just doing it for themselves.
Mhm.
Is this maybe one of kind of the most principle of Jesus's teachings, and that is be aware of yourself
Mm,
with relation to God, to righteousness, to how a life should be lived.
mhm,
Introspection, I think, is he wants you to know yourself, and because otherwise you can't become righteous or as the person that God is intending you to be. You
mhm.
need to see more clearly what you are and therefore what you're dealing with in order to achieve this life. And so all of these things are, if you look at it, they're things that you should know about yourself and then and comprehend, and then you'll know what to do about it.
I think that's really helpful, and it connects in my mind to what Fred was saying about Jesus asking us, commanding us, teaching to help others, but we can't help others until we've done our own internal work. That's really how I hear that. And I think that's what you're saying as well, Ellie, is that, it's more than simply going through motions, because it's about a transformation of heart as well as head and hands.
Isn't it back to the original line there? This is just kind of another way of saying, judge not that you not be judged,
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Mm,
So it's just it's just another example of that.
mhm.
Mhm.
But I am
People in
still-
glass houses shouldn't throw stones. or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like
Exactly.
that one, yes.
Yeah.
Get rid
Yeah.
of that log.
I'm still
Yeah.
troubled by the quid pro quo
Can you say more about that, Fred?
for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged.
Mm,
And the measure you use will be measured. It's the same thing as, forgive your debtors,
Mm,
because you are going to, and yet, Jesus preaches unlimited forgiveness.
mhm,
And then, he says, but God is God is not gonna be unlimited. He's gonna measure you against what you've done to others. It just seems like we're being called upon to be more, more merciful, more ethical, more forgiving than God himself.
I didn't even see God in this, Fred. I was reading
Just
this
gonna ask
from a
that.
completely secular, I mean, human to human. Don't judge. It's like I have a friend, he's still alive, God bless him, who used to give me a lot of advice on raising children. And then
Yeah.
3 weeks after he had their first child was born, he stopped giving advice. And I pointed that out to him at the time, probably a log in my own eye, but I couldn't help but tell him about that. He still remembers it to this day. He will tell that story. But it seems to me we've all been it's a very human situation. And God can do what God will with it. But among us humans, if we are going to help and heal and be whole with each other, this advice applies. I mean,
Yeah. My wife, when we got married, had written into the marriage ceremony something that she was very sensitive about, which goes to this point. And she said, I want you to say as part of the marriage ceremony, and I promise that I will not try to solve your problems. I'll just listen.
Ah,
And,
The
and
Martha
when we
Meeting-
said that at the wedding, the entire audience just broke up in laughter.
Oh, yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah.
hmm.
I think we've talked in this group before, maybe it's a different group, but I think it's in this group that tends to fall along gender lines,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
sure it does.
Does.
Sure does.
That's
Yeah.
a
Absolutely.
conversation we have in my house at least once a week, if not more frequently.
Yeah, I think the
Tell me.
male attitude is, why are you telling me this problem if you don't want any answers to it?
yes,
Hmm.
Yeah,
We can fix this.
exactly.
yeah.
Go to YouTube
Is
and
it-
find the video.
This is an engineering problem. Yes.
Exactly. That's all it is.
You know, it's
Yeah,
the point where when I do premarital counseling, I usually bring that very issue into it. It's like, okay, when you hear her tell you something or share a concern, what do you want to do about it? Wow. You know, it's classic. I very rarely find a couple for whom that's not a heterosexual couple for whom that's not the issue. So, or an issue.
speaking to Ray's story, when my brother was born, our pediatrician had a son at about the same time. And my mother used to say he came in and he gave, this wonderful lecture about how, the baby is joining your life and you can't let him control it and you have to be the parent and, be strong and, take control. And she said, when I was born, he came in and did, going through his normal thing and was getting ready to leave. And she said, "Oh, Dr. Peacock, aren't you going to give me that wonderful lecture again?" And he looked at her and said, "It doesn't work." I think it made her feel much better,
I love that.
but it's still, there's still this, this is the second time in, 200 words that we have this quid pro quo.
Well,
And that's
But why does
troubling
that
to
bother
me.
you?
What?
Why does that bother you, Fred?
Because I think it's almost like it's part of what I think Jesus didn't go buy into the sacrificial nature of traditional Jewish faith. God is
But this is-
infinitely forgiving. God is infinitely,
But-
there is no
humans
quid
aren't.
pro quo. You don't bargain with God.
Yeah, but
It's not.
I think getting away from the quid pro quo, I think is important. I know it's in the text and it's a little disturbing, but I think what he's really getting at here is that there's going to be a common standard. It's not as though you can judge yourself by one standard and be harsher with other people.
Mhm.
There should be a universal standard that applies to you and your neighbor. And so, just be careful, if you're applying a standard to other people, right? The rule is you have to have a universal standard. There's no special rule for yourself. The rule you apply to other people will be the rule that you have to apply to yourself. And that's the same idea behind do unto others as you would have others do to them. It's a common law that applies to all
Yeah.
people. You can't say other people should keep their promises, but when I make my promise, I'm allowed to break it because, well, I'm an attempt, right? It's a common rule that applies to people. It's not so much a quid pro quo.
Well, and again, to Ray's point, and I understand why we might be tempted to hear that as God doing the judging, but Jesus isn't saying that actually. And, it seems, and one of the things in Matthew's gospel, and I think I've mentioned this before, and we will get to it, is later in the gospel. Matthew's really interested in how the church, how the earliest group of followers of Jesus order themselves. And he's really interested in, some of the rules of engagement for Christian community, although Christian, that's an anachronistic word, right? But so it may be that this is really about how do you live together in community. And
I have to disagree with you, Patty, because I go back to the prior chapter.
but I'm not talking about the prior chapter, I'm talking about this chapter.
Yeah, but the two quid pro quos are linked. I don't think you can say that they're just totally separate.
But why? So, okay, looking at, and you can disagree, it's a fact that Matthew's gospel is very interested in how the Christian community is ordered.
Oh, yes.
So
But
that
Jesus
was
is speaking for God in 14 and 15. And if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your
Right.
sins.
Right. But here he's not talking about the Father. So that's all I'm suggesting is that, and I began this by saying, I understand why one might think that this is about God, but whereas in the previous section, Jesus does specifically say that about the Father, here he's not. And so that's why, he's talking about neighbor to neighbor. And so I just think that that context is important. And again, to Ray's point, God can do what God wants to do, right? God is God. And we just need to be cautious about reducing God to human standards or I can never say that word, anthropomorphizing God too much.
I accept the fact that, one of the ways that you can square this circle is to say he's God and you're not.
Mhm, mhm.
That was one of the things in Job. Where they said, God wants to do it, God can do it, and it's right.
But I say that if you're hearing this as God doing the judging, I don't hear God doing the judging in this section. In the previous chapter, what you were citing, Fred, I totally agree. I mean, Jesus says the Father, your Father. But here, the passive voice also makes it harder to parse out. And I don't know if looking at the Greek would be helpful or not, but we can try. Yeah, do not judge so that you will not be judged. That's not very clear as to who's doing the judging. Yeah. I mean, I think in a context where where Jesus is talking about, not focusing on the speck in another's eye when you have a log in your own, to me, that sounds neighbor to neighbor,
Mhm.
brother to brother, sister to sister. So there is a quid pro quo neighbor to neighbor, but not necessarily God here. That's all I'm.
Yeah, it's unsure. He was at the end of the last chapter, he was definitely speaking about God.
Sure.
And maybe he is speaking about, or this could be something that the early Christians added.
Or it could be, as I said earlier, a saying of Jesus that Matthew edited together in this order. Because remember that the gospelers are taking oral material and knitting them together, stitching them together in a way that makes sense for the way they want to tell the story. So, which is again may have something to do with why Matthew puts this on the mountain and Luke doesn't.
Can I put two points, one of them quick. The quick point is at the end of that, what we have as a paragraph, end of 5, you're still going to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye.
Mhm.
You still have that obligation. But you're in a better position to do it, very human to human. The other one that's poured little kerosene on Fred's fire is that this, this seems to me to be this, and clear down to 12 particularly, the wisdom of so many of the world's religions.
Mhm,
This is not unique to Christianity or Judaism.
mhm,
This is how human beings can live with each other peacefully
mhm.
and with happiness. And it seems to me so universal that we don't, the people who don't even, who are non-believers can agree with this.
There is.
You don't
you
need to
used the
bring
word-
God into it.
You use the word at the beginning of that sentence, right, about wisdom, and there is something about wisdom literature in this section for sure.
Yeah,
You just said that about taking the speck out of your neighbor's eye, and it makes me wonder to ask, what does that look like? What does it mean to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye? Because to me, that's different from pointing out the speck in your neighbor's eye. What does it mean to remove that speck?
lifting your finger and touching the speck to bring it out. If you have a child with a speck in her eye, and you lift the eyelid, wet your finger, and you can bring it out.
Or Kleenex.
And so, and so Jesus would spit and do it for sure. But what does that look
Yeah.
like in terms of human relationships? What does it mean to take the speck out of someone's eye more metaphorically?
Maybe it means that sometimes you communicate with somebody and you help that person to see something that they couldn't see before.
Hmm.
I mean, it's not all negative.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we do
Mhm.
communicate with one another and help one another and advise one another in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's also a more intimate contact. It's one-on-one. I mean, you
Yeah.
look the person in
Yeah.
the eye.
Lovely.
As
Oh, I
close
like
as you can
that.
get.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so hanging on to that, or following along with that idea of intimacy, and with what Donna was saying, that you can help it seems to me that Jesus is saying you can help the person see more clearly once you admit your own stuff. And if we think about effective communication, right, and this is where I really agree with what you said, Ray, about this kind of transcending Jesus's context. If we just think about effective human discourse, it's always smart to begin by saying, well, I struggle with X, and it's much easier to get the other person to begin to see his or her speck if we can model that. And there's some compassion, some empathy, some just human connection. And so when you said that about Ellie, about that being intimate, that really struck me, because you're right. It's person to person, very up close and personal, literally and figuratively.
I wonder if we should take the idea of the eye and people seeing things, a little more literally.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is, all of us have these blinders and presuppositions and prejudices that make us unable to see the world the way it really is. And yet we look around the world and we say, God, I wish those other people would see the world correctly. They're so ignorant. They're so biased. They're so one-sided. They should be, more objective and look at the world the way it really is, instead of through their own prejudices. But then again, you might want to take a look at yourself first. When we look at the world, we've got our own little baggage that we bring along with it, and we see certain things and miss other things. And so before you run around to the rest of the world and say to them, you should see things the way I do, maybe you should step back a little bit and see what you take for granted and what your presuppositions are. And then maybe you'll be in a better position to clearly take the speck out of your neighbor's eye to let that person see things more clearly.
That was
It-
lovely.
Is there any
Beautiful.
relationship between this eye reference and the eye reference in the last chapter?
The lamp of the body.
The
Your
eye
eyes
is the
are
lamp of
good.
the body.
If your
Mm.
eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light.
I would think so. Let's just pull it.
I don't see it necessarily, but I just wonder if
There it was. Yeah.
it's
Well, I
not
think-
there somehow.
Yeah, I think it is, at least in the sense of just as the heart was understood as the seat of emotion. I think culturally, contextually, what that eye represents, I think you're right. I think there is a connection in terms of how we perceive the world and what we project to the world. In terms of, if your eye is healthy, your body will be full of light. And well, what do we mean by that? Well, if we are able to see rightly, and I realize that rightly sounds subjective, but to Jesus, it's not so subjective, it's pretty objective. If we can see rightly, then we will be healthy. And I think we could extrapolate from that pretty easily. I think there's definitely a connection, Fred.
I think it brings to mind for me that, when we talk about people seeing eye to eye, like
Mm.
the perceptions being the same, coming to a common perception or an understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, good idea.
Which is hard work, right? It's really hard work. And email and text don't help that, of course. And that's not what Jesus is talking about, obviously. When we think about those barriers to understanding and communication, there's so much that makes life more efficient. You can just shoot off a message, but you can't hear tone. And, it's just seeing eye to eye, I think, is even more challenging now.
It makes it kind of significant that emoji usually are faces.
Yeah, because those pictures can communicate something that the words don't always express. That's a really good point.
One thing I was thinking of was the comparison that's been drawn between Moses and coming down from the mountain. And when you think of the 10 Commandments, except for loving the Lord thy God and thy neighbor as thyself, it's mostly what you shouldn't do. It's the rules. Here's a rule, don't kill anybody, don't commit adultery. But the tone, if it is at all faithful to what Jesus said, the tone is so intimate and so helpful and so everyday. It's such a kind of a typical New Testament tone to it that's, I think, really in stark contrast to the bringing the tablets down from the mountain.
That's lovely. Yeah. Yeah, that emphasis on every day. There's a practicality to this that Jesus is talking about.
Donna, I love that. It sets up in my mind a parallel, because the 10 Commandments, among other things, aside from the love God and all, but it's things you can't do if you're going to live together as a community, as a tribe, and survive. This is what you can do and must do to carry those things out, to carry it further. It's fine not to murder anybody, but that isn't the end of the story. And that I love the way you put that.
Which is the whole reason that Jesus came down, is to apply these laws to actual people. And that's why I've always been charmed by the idea of God actually sending Jesus, because okay, I've been, he's giving out all the rules, but this is, oh, they're not getting it. Okay, well, let's figure out. I always thought that Jesus was a learning experience for God as much as it was for us.
Isn't that interesting? Wonderful.
That's funny, because the Old Testament Yale courses, the woman who teaches it says the Old Testament is just a one example after another of God thinking he had it worked out and then having to adjust because, I mean, sure, he thought he had, the rules laid out and,
Thought it was clear.
and humanity, screwed it up again.
I love the way that's framed. That's wonderful. It's like, okay, let's try again. That's, yeah, that's great. What do you all make?
We've
And I
got-
just want to, oh, go ahead, Ray.
No, I was just laughing with Fred on that one.
I
You've got
love,
you've got the theory. Now let's get the lab book out and
exactly.
test it.
Like, okay, let's try this again. And I don't want to necessarily move on from that first paragraph, but I'm curious what people think about the teaching in the paragraph that's labeled here, ask, search, knock. Ask and it will be given. Search and you'll find, you're probably hearing seek ye first now, that earworm hymn. What do you make of that paragraph in, either in this context or not, whichever?
I would relate it to the previous chapter,
Mm-hmm.
where he says, why do you worry about clothes? Why do you worry about having enough to eat?
Mm-hmm.
This is a further elaboration of, every day the troubles are sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And, you don't have to keep, worrying about things. Life will take care of itself.
Mm-hmm. How do
Echoing
you, oh, I'm sorry, Ray, go ahead.
I was just going to say that sounds like it's echoing that often heard "Be not afraid."
Yes.
Yeah.
Don't be paralyzed by fear.
And then, so that's, I think that's absolutely right. And in your experience, in our experience, how's that going for you? Does anyone struggle with this, or is it just?
Yeah, I struggle with it because it's a little bit glib. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would say, well, I sought and I didn't find. And, but the takeaway that I have that means something to me is, if you don't seek, you certainly will never find.
Oh, Bobby Orr's statement that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yep.
Mhm.
I feel
Well,
like I must watch like too much Criminal Minds or something because I'm like, like when you're thinking about like people who are asking, like, let's say families who have a child with cancer or who is terminal or something like that, like there's a level of patience, I think, when you're going to be answered, that as Christians we don't get yet, because we can say ask and it will be given to you. Well, we can ask for a lot of things that we don't get, and we might be getting sustenance in some very deep, meaningful spiritual way that we're not able to understand. I think half of my prayers are like, help me understand whatever messaging you're giving me, because I've asked, it could be there, but I don't recognize, sometimes we don't recognize God's good works. I just find it interesting that it sounds so simplistic, but it's not. It's,
Perhaps the bad news is that this passage reminds me of a Rolling Stone song,
Talk about an earworm.
which goes, you can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you might
what
just
you
get
need.
what you need.
Yeah.
yeah.
So, ask the Lord
Love it.
for something. You might not get what you want, but you'll get what you need. And that's the reassurance that you'll get an answer. You'll receive something back. It may not be what you expected or hoped
Yeah.
for,
Mhm.
I feel like it's so
Mhm.
privileged though to say that there are many faithful people praying for certain things who are really suffering. You know, how does that equate to this, you know?
Mhm.
Well, as Stone said, you don't always get what you want,
Mhm.
but make it. But I think I'm seeing in this a repetition of Jesus's urge to introspection.
Hmm.
That if you seek inside yourself and just just be more aware of within yourself and of what you actually want, and ask for that. I'm not sure, but again, this is I'm not praying to God for a pony. I'm keep
Perhaps, link it
sitting
to
within.
Saint Francis of Assisi's prayer, that you're not praying for yourself as much as or the old Celtic prayer, the
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 wisdom
wisdom
to know the difference.
the strength to put up with what I can't change, the courage to try and change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. A lot of what you're praying for should be to improve yourself, not to improve, not to just get the pony.
Again,
I've
introspection.
never prayed for a pony.
Right, that's why
afraid
you've
to.
never had a pony, I guess.
Yes, yeah, it's right on Donna's point. If you don't ask, you'll never
Don't
get
You're
it.
not gonna get it. So what do you make of 9 and 10? Is there anyone among you who, if your child asked for bread, would give a stone? Or if the child asked for a fish, would give a snake? What's Jesus getting at there?
God knows what you need, and what you should have.
God is even more generous than we are. Like, we're flawed as people. So God is even, as much as we love our children, he loves us even that much more and wholly, and
Hmm.
Holy.
Mm-hmm. And again, I hear such a practical, relatable lesson in that, right? Because Jesus is talking, and to your point, Ellie, about this is why the incarnation, right? This is why Jesus comes, because it's not Jesus or God up on high pontificating. It's Jesus saying, okay, you're a parent, you got kids, think about it this way. And so it's Jesus right up close and personal, entering in to that experience and being able to speak that language, that I think is particularly helpful, that New Testament focus, as Donna was saying. So in Fred's, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ellie.
I was just going to say, Jesus had parents.
Mm-hmm.
God never did.
Excellent. There's such
Well, if you
wisdom
watch enough
about-
TV and crime shows and the agony and whatever, one of the inescapable conclusions is that your parents do give you rocks and snakes. Some parents do, at least.
Mhm.
I think all of us parents do.
Yeah.
Mm.
But once again, you relate this back to the previous chapter in which he says God knows what you need.
Mhm.
God knows what you need, and he's going to make sure you get it if you let him.
Mhm.
but if you
So,
translate that literally, okay, like there are children dying of starvation. I know there's tens of millions of people praying that children don't die of starvation around the world. I know there's tens of millions of people praying for world peace. Those are things we need. Those are the needs. I guess what I'm saying is, when are they being met? You know, where, you know, are they being met in heaven? Are they being met on earth? Like, there are many things that we all ask for that we need, or we want other people to need. We might not be in need of a roof over our heads or food or whatever, but a lot of people need that, right? And you know, how do we answer for those things that the suffering that we see?
Great question, Kim. What do you all think?
Well, I will go back to a sermon we heard recently about starting with small things. And I mean, some of us, probably everybody on the screen, contributes some way or another to feeding programs, to charities that make that small step. It doesn't solve the problem for everybody, but it is an answer to somebody's prayer that day when that package of cornmeal and milk arrives, you know? And it's the way I can't, I'm powerless to do anything big about it. God hasn't given me that power, but he has given me the power to write a check or swipe a credit card and help the process along. And maybe try not to elect any snakes who will, you know, make it worse.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
The-
take on it, but that's very personal.
The problem of acting as a society is one thing, but you know, for the most part, Jesus wasn't starting a church. He was very sensitive to, you know, the needs of community,
Mhm.
but but most of his, you know, teachings are not about how to live as a community. He's not writing the Benedictine rule or the, you know, or whatever. He's telling you how to improve yourself.
And well, yes and no. He's telling you how to improve yourself, but you don't exist in a vacuum. That first paragraph there is all about living in community together. That's, you know, it's impossible in this context to understand oneself over against the community in which one is placed. So,
But even in terms of living in that community, it's about working on your own, you know,
Yep.
it's about working on your own attitudes and your own philosophy.
taking the plank out of your own eye.
Yeah, you work on taking the plank out of your own eye before you.
Mhm.
So I think, you know, to me, Jesus, you know, Paul started churches. Paul got out there and said, let's all get together and do this. Jesus, you know, taught more of this is how you behave.
And I want to keep reminding us that these are Jesus's sayings, and Matthew has
Oh,
fitted them together in a particular way. And Matthew's goal is very much about how the earliest followers lived together. Matthew, so those two things reside side by side.
yeah.
Yep.
And I think Kim put her finger on the real problem with the passage. And the thing that struck me, I don't know to think about this, is that when you read it, the asking and the receiving, the door opening, all that stuff is in the passive voice, right? It's
Mhm.
not at all clear who's supposed to be doing the good stuff. That when you ask, you know, something happens in response, that, you know, it's the agent of providing what you need. And as Kim points out, you often don't get it. You know, the agent is invisible. You don't know who that is. What is it? Nature, the world, society, who? And the other side of that is when you don't get what you need, which is Kim's problem, it's not clear who to blame. You know, all those starving children throughout the world. What do you say? Who? What? How do we fix that?
Mhm.
And so the passive voice here just strikes me as being food for thought.
That's a really great observation. I'm wondering, for folks who are using a different translation other than, I've got the NRSV here, do any of the translations render it in the active voice, or is it all passive voice for everybody? I'm just curious. I don't know if there are any that put it active voice.
I've got New English and it's pretty passive.
Okay.
You will receive, but again, it doesn't specify how that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Let me just take a peek at the Greek.
Remember also, Jesus was, urging people to step out of the society that they were in. That happiness and, serving God was not, getting more bread, more fish, storing up your, building another barn to hold the harvest.
Hmm.
And, if you shared down to your absolute bare minimum level, now Jesus society, you lived with your family till you died at, 35 or so. He had very little advice on, what to do with your 401k.
Well, and when you say that, Fred, it reminds me too, if we think about the people of Israel in the wilderness, right? And they're starving and they're fetching and they want to go back to slavery in Egypt. It was better there, yada, yada. And the story goes that God rains down manna for them, but it doesn't, it's not, you don't store up the manna, right? It
Goes bad.
and so you eat, you get enough to satisfy your absolute basic need. And then there's the need to trust that it will rain down manna again the next day. And so, this line about if your child asks for bread, yeah, you're going to get bread, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a whole bakery. You're going to get a crust that's going to sustain you. So that's a really helpful point. If we chunk this the way that Ellie's and Fred's Bibles do, and we end this section, sort of the capstone of this section is the quote unquote golden rule, right? In everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets. So if this is meant to kind of sum up these first 12 verses, what do you make of that? Does that shed any light? Is it obvious? Am I making something out of it that isn't there? What do you all think?
Well, it certainly harks back to the first few, do not judge and so on. The search and find is, I'm not sure how that applies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How it fits.
Oh, judge, and the idea of do unto others. I mean, taking the example of judgment is one, but that isn't the only one. He's saying that applies to all of the human relations.
Just such a universal concept.
Mm-hmm.
It appears in all the, all major spiritual disciplines.
Playground fairness.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, saying we're social animals,
Mm-hmm.
that's inbred in us to favor fairness and justice. And, those are the people we want to hang out with.
Because why would you hang out with anyone else? Yeah, just
I
human.
mean, I think the rule is meant to counteract a real human tendency to favor your own case,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, say, yeah, I'm special, I'm unique, I can get to do this because I'm exempt, and we all sort of feel
Yeah.
that, and yet
Yeah.
we know we live in a society, and that's not going to work because everybody else, if they feel that way, then it all collapses. I mean, the example before, we'd all like to make promises that we don't have to keep, but the world doesn't work very well if that's the way everyone behaves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's meant to counteract this very human tendency for self-preference. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Is there a particular Christian spin on this? Absolutely agree that the golden rule teaching is universal. Is there something in Christianity? Is there something that is there a because that's connected to this? In other words, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you, because yes, for this is the law and the prophets. Okay, it's kind of like because I say so. But in Christian theology, what is the undergirding belief that makes us want to do unto others as we would have them do to us?
Oh, we're all children of God.
Yeah, exactly.
We're all made in the image and likeness of God. So we have this inherent dignity and reverence that needs to be respected. And the way you respect people is by treating them fairly, not giving yourself a break, but treating them as if they were children of God. So that's my take.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And it's baptism. This is, the grounding of our baptismal covenant, that we are exactly what you said, Mark, created in the image of God, children of God, inherently worthy of respect and dignity. Exactly what you just said. And as such, there's a saying, and I can't remember who said it, but it shows up in social media every now and then. You'll never look in the face of somebody whom God doesn't love. And that's like, wow, okay. But it comes back to our inherent identity as children of God, and that we're all connected in that way. So it's more than just vested self-interest. It's that, we are all parts of the same whole and created of the same stuff.
I do think that in some senses, I mean, love being the basis of Christianity, it makes sense that it ties to Christianity, but I do think that there is something very ecumenical about this as
Oh,
well.
absolutely.
That other religions
Yeah.
would take this same, piece, particularly the Jewish religion.
And other religions do. I mean, there is variant of this in all of the major religions. So that's a given. And so that's why I was asking, as Christians, what's our why, right? What's the reason for us? Is it just about, it makes good sense if you're going to live together in society, or is there a theological, spiritual grounding underneath it? So, yeah.
I think the theological point is really crucial, because otherwise you can say, I'll be good to people in my community, my tribe, right? And everybody else, I don't care. There's a great scene in The Wild Bunch, which is a wonderful movie where the two outlaws are talking to each other. They're pursuing a guy who used to be a member of their gang, who's now joined law enforcement. And they say, one of them says, I understand why he did it. He made a deal. He made a promise to the sheriff that he would pursue us and try to capture us. I understand that perfectly. And Ernest Borgnine says, it doesn't matter that he made a promise, it's who you make it to. As if, if you make a promise to a law enforcement guy, it doesn't count. He's the enemy. Well, you know what? I mean, I get his point. It makes perfect sense, but this is designed to counteract that. To say, you can't say, well, I made a promise to you and you don't count. You're not a real person. You're not someone I owe anything to. And the Christian belief that we're all children of God sort of creates that universality, that you can't just make a promise to the people you like and not make a promise to people you don't like. Deals are deals are deals. It's universal. And I like the theological basis for this, because it does create that kind of universality that transcends tribes.
And I agree. And that's where the really hard work comes in. And it's all connected, I think, again, to that first paragraph in this chapter about planks and specks, because it's calling us to a higher standard. And that, and as we think about Jesus telling us to love our enemies, yikes, that's really hard work. And to forgive people who've done horrific things, again, very challenging. And we can understand it as if Jesus is helping us to get a glimpse of and help build the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God here and now, then we've got to up our game a little bit, and we've got to have a higher standard, because otherwise it's the kingdom of this empire, which, isn't so hot.
I think that is the quid pro quo. You don't get, it's not that God is going to, not forgive you. It is that you just can't get there carrying all the baggage that, we carry normally.
You got to drop some of it. Got to leave
Yeah.
some of that behind.
You can
And,
put
I
that in
think
sacrificial.
Hmm?
I was gonna say, you can put that in sacrificial language. I mean, you have to give up something of yourself and your selfish viewpoint, to put it mildly, in order to move on, to live. I mean,
well, if there is a sacrifice, you can't be selfish and, get these spiritual benefits.
Hmm?
but anybody who has raised kids know that you have to get past that stage with each and every one of them, where they are the center of the universe and their desires are the only desires.
Hmm?
And
we all
some
have
people never make it.
well, that's yeah, that's true. But I mean, if this is advice here,
Yeah.
how to get past that and the need to recognize it, looking for the beam.
There's an interesting thing in the family section of the post about developmental stages of children and how to teach children compassion, and saying, at this age, they just don't have the brain to do this. At this age, this is when you start working on this, and maybe humanities like that, just takes us a while to get the point.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of arrested development going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's right.
I think you have to focus on yourself. There's that age where, they will come running towards you covered in blood and you say, "Oh, you're not hurt." And they believe you. It stops hurting. They walk
maybe,
away.
But not mine.
It doesn't last more than a few weeks, but you tell them that they're not hurt and they believe you. But if they're going to survive, they have to know in reality when you're hungry, when you need to eat, when you need to care for yourself. You have to know how to put yourself first in certain situations, or at least know what your
Love
needs
your
are.
neighbor as yourself.
And most of people get through that and then if you're lucky, you start to realize that that's not the be all and end all of existence.
Hmm?
And that you have to start putting other people in give them importance and take care of them, and whatever, however you want to phrase it. And I gotta say, some people never make that leap.
They don't.
A former president comes to mind. That they're just focused on themselves the rest of their entire lives.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who live that way.
Yeah. And there's nothing, you can't force them to change.
And then I'm going to just circle back to the beginning, and I wonder, where the logs are in our own eyes, where it is that we need to do that work too. And that's the humbling piece, right? Is that it's really easy to spot it in someone else and much harder to spot it in ourselves. I don't know.
Well, I have much more perspective in, with other people. I can take misfortune philosophically as long as it's not my misfortune.
It's not your misfortune. Exactly. I think that's right. Well, dear friends, we are past the hour, so it's probably a good place to stop. That was a great conversation. And next week, maybe we'll finish chapter 7. And maybe we can spend a few minutes just kind of reflecting on the Sermon on the Mount as a piece before we move on. Because there's no question, this is a central part of the New Testament, of the Gospels, and certainly of Matthew's Gospel, or these 3 chapters we've been working our way through. So it's good stuff. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Patty.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
And I'll
Thanks.
see you
Thanks,
next time.
Patty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You, bye.